Well, I'm going to start where you ended. You gave a very compelling argument that there's a pattern in history, especially since World War II, of the underdog who has right on their side winning. Why can't people in power see that?
I think that's a very important issue that I've thought about a lot. And I think the simplistic but still instructive answer is because our bureaucracy and our media have become so militarized over the course of this period since the end of World War II and subsequent decades, that it's both impolitic and unnatural to think outside the military box. And so we keep reinventing how to win these conflicts that are occurring in the global South. And if you notice the response to Syria and to ISIS or to the Paris attacks, it's always one of let's do more militarily. There's very little freedom of the political imagination to consider non-military ways of resolving conflict. And that's partly because the military budget has remained so high. It's partly because the think tanks in Washington are very capable of sustaining this kind of ideological outlook. I had as a student some years ago David Petraeus, who made his reputation by reinventing counterinsurgency warfare. That is, trying to say what happened in Vietnam was an anomaly and that we could fix it by treating the civilian population of the target society in a more understanding way, and by shifting our tactics using new technologies, drones being the most dramatic example, and finding ways to make the military instruments successful and effective as part of the global domination strategy being pursued by Washington.
Well, today as we speak, the British Parliament voted to send the UK's 2 or 3 remaining warplanes into Syria. There was a big debate about that. Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party leader, who's a long-time anti-war activist and supporter of Palestinian rights, spoke eloquently and I think sensibly about the long history of not just the failure of war, but its tendency to produce more violence. And yet, a majority voted yet again for more bombing. Are there alternatives to bombing?
Yes, of course. Again, I should have said in my earlier answer that it's not just the political establishment that has learned to think within this military box. It's also the political consciousness that has governed Western understandings of security. And it is deeply embedded in our own society, and one dimension of it is the gun culture. We think, we identify in a very dysfunctional way the power to destroy with the ability to be secure. And that's a very false identification. No, we are capable of doing something other than this if it's not seen as an immediate threat. For instance, we have been talking privately to the Taliban in Afghanistan with the idea of trying to find a political formula that is an alternative to what would otherwise seem to be permanent warfare in the country. So one can ask, why can we talk to the enemy in Afghanistan but not in these other settings? Why do we treat Hamas differently than the Taliban? Or why do we not even consider that there may be grievances that these groups have? I have mentioned sometimes a presentation that John Major made about his diplomacy in Northern Ireland, where he said that he only made progress in reaching some kind of ceasefire and accommodation in Northern Ireland when he stopped thinking of the IRA as a terrorist organization and began realizing that they were a political actor that had grievances, and if those grievances were addressed, diplomacy was possible.
To come back to the question of international law, you gave in your remarks a very comprehensive indictment of the failure of the United Nations on the question of Palestine. And I know that I, like many others, will continue to cite this UN resolution or that UN resolution, or point out how many resolutions are being breached by Israeli settlements or the siege of Gaza or any number of other practices. In your role as UN Special Rapporteur, your role was to investigate, to present the results objectively of what you found, and to recommend action. It must have been very frustrating for you to see those recommendations so consistently ignored or set aside. So I have two questions. Is can you recall, tell us some of the inner workings of how the pressure, how the pressure within the UN works, and secondly, how do you retain, or do you retain any faith in the possibility of international law after being UN Special Rapporteur and dealing with Israel?
No, those are important, quite searching questions. Let me say two things at first. The UN is no better or worse than the behavior of its most important members. That's people forget that.
And that's Micronesia and the Marshall Islands.
But it's also Libya. See, when geopolitical forces want the UN to be effective, it can be very effective, maybe too effective. But when the geopolitical forces, as has been the case over the years with Palestine, are trying to resist UN authority, then UN authority cannot be implemented behaviorally. But it's very important, my second point is very important to recognize that the UN, despite its limitations in implementing in a behaviorally relevant way these resolutions that you refer to, it has a great deal of symbolic leverage. It is the most important venue for resolving claims about what is just in the world. And the whole buildup of the global solidarity movement has rested in large part, or I'd say in significant part, on the fact that it is reinforced by international law and by UN authority. So there's the UN is a failure for Palestine behaviorally, but it's a success, an important asset for the Palestinian struggle symbolically. And that's why Israel and indirectly the US get so furious with the UN. If it mattered not at all, it would be ignored. The Israelis are not stupid. They understand, and they've made a great emphasis in recent years on what they call the delegitimation project as threatening to their future security. And the delegitimation project is essentially saying we're losing the struggle to control the moral and legal heights, and that has political implications. What those implications are remains to be seen. It doesn't always come out the way one would like it to come out. And I sometimes refer to Tibet as a leading example where the Dalai Lama has led a successful legitimacy war on behalf of the Tibetan people. But the geopolitical forces are too strong to overcome. And so China has successfully maintained its position of dominance and control. So I think what it's important to understand, both for the UN and international law, is its limitations, but also its usefulness. And one has to think in very concrete and sometimes institutional terms about where it can be useful. Also, what is the role of civil society? Civil society activism on the Palestinian issue, I think, relies very much on the congruence between its objectives and the sense of what is morally and legally right.
You've talked about that struggle, you write about it, that what you call the legitimacy war or legitimacy struggle. You've spoken and written about that, and the role of civil society activism, particularly boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which is a Palestinian-led movement that began a decade ago and is, to a large extent, modeled on the kind of sanctions and boycott and pressure that was put on apartheid South Africa. There's been a counter attack, let's say, by Israel, not surprisingly, and by Israel lobby groups. But it's included in the past year or two, legislative efforts in various state legislatures and in the US Congress to limit this movement. Is boycott, divestment, and sanctions a legitimate set of tactics? Is it free speech? And what legitimacy do these legislative and other efforts have to suppress it?
Well, I think there's no doubt in my mind that until the relevance of what I was calling the special relationship entered the process, no one questioned the legality and legitimacy of boycott and divestment, nonviolent tactics designed to express a political and moral point of view. There was much opposition to the use of these tactics in the South African context, including at my university at Princeton. The Board of Trustees and the President were very much opposed to it, but no one even thought to question its legality as a tactic. It was a political issue. Was it more important to keep the investments of the university free from moral and political concerns, or was it more important to show solidarity with the struggle against apartheid? It was seen in those terms. And if, in a way, it's an extension, your question is an extension of my main presentation. This is the domestic, deforming repercussions of the special relationship. We wouldn't do this with any other country, probably not even with Saudi Arabia. It is only because of this status that Israel has achieved that we're willing to undercut our own traditions of civil liberties and human rights in order to insulate this special relationship from the kind of pressures that are being mounted.
I don't know if it's a challenge, but throw something else in on this question of the special relationship. There's no doubt that there is a special relationship. There's no doubt that the Israel lobby exercises tremendous power and influence in this country, particularly on political elites. We see that in the crushingly lopsided votes taken in Congress in, any time during the war on Gaza, for example, when Israel was killing 11 children a day in Gaza in the summer of 2014. But at the same time, there are signs of fractures, and I want to give you a couple and see what you make of them. There were a number of polls during Israel's attack on Gaza in the summer of 2014 that showed that major subgroups of the US population opposed what Israel was doing. That included the Democratic Party base, it included young people, and it included people of color. And one of the stark examples of that was a Gallup poll that showed that people over 30 supported Israel's attack on Gaza by, I think, 51% to 25%. But for under 30s, it was the reverse, the complete reverse. So that's one indicator. Again, there's a trend in the polling that we see. Another is that when Benjamin Netanyahu came to the United States, I think in March, to give his speech to Congress, 60 members of Congress boycotted it, which is unprecedented. And then in the battle waged over the deal with Iran, the Israel lobby is seen as having completely lost that battle. Is that just a limited difference between Israel and the United States, or does it portend some kind of bigger shift?
Well, I think it's a mixture of the two. I think there is a shift in the political consciousness of the people living in this country, particularly the young, as that poll indicates. And I've noticed in my own experience that those that support Israel are much less inclined than they were a few years ago to engage on the substance of issues that are raised, like the argument over the invasion of the attack on Gaza in 2014. And in a way, that gap between the shifting public opinion and the failure to make any commensurate adjustment in Washington illustrates part of the problem to me. It's very hard to translate the changing. I think the American public would accept a normal relationship with Israel at this time, but the Beltway wouldn't. And it's finding a way to create a new situation where Washington gets the message. And it's a message in the interest of even the American strategic objectives in the world. It's not a radical message, actually. It would serve the cause of the Kissingers of this world to deal with Israel as a normal country and to seek a genuine political accommodation. Your other two examples, the Netanyahu, the walkout of the 60 senators, you have to put that in the context that this was an outrageous intrusion on American political normalcy to have a foreign leader come to a joint session of Congress and attack a principal foreign policy objective of the elected president just before his own election. The fact that the rest of the Congress stayed there and applauded is what seems to me to be the most salient feature of that event. The outrage of allowing this kind of presentation, of sabotaging a very important foreign policy initiative that was not only an American initiative. All 5 of the permanent members of the Security Council were supportive of the move to resolve the Iranian nuclear issue in this way, plus Germany. And again, the agreement itself was so strongly supported by the Western alliance and by the major powers in the world that even the special relationship couldn't stand up successfully in opposition to it. But again, I think it's it's a moment in that special relationship that's like an unexpected change in the direction of the current. Since the agreement, the U.S. has gone out of its way to reassure Israel that nothing has changed. It sent high officials, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, to make as nice as possible with Netanyahu in Tel Aviv. It has offered Israel even more military assistance than the $3 billion that we already give.
They're talking, I think, about renewing. I think they do the U.S. military aid deal on a 10-year term. So what's being published is that they're talking about renewing it from 2017 for $5 billion a year.
Yeah, right. See, that's all so-called compensation for the fact that we didn't do what Israel wanted us to do, which would have been horribly destructive of stability. Well, I shouldn't say stability, but it would have contributed to intensification of the turbulence and the danger of real spreading regional war in the Middle East. And it would have been a great blow to American leadership of the Western alliance, because the European countries very much wanted this agreement. So my sense is that the special relationship is alive and well, and that nothing fundamental has changed.
I want to, in your opening remarks, you said something that appears, I think, does make a lot of sense, that with all the regional turmoil and the calamities that are going on for so many people in Iraq, in Syria, in Egypt and other in Yemen, that in a sense the focus has moved away from Palestine. You also pointed out that the longevity of what Palestinians have been enduring for decade upon decade. I want to put something different to you, that Israel is, in a sense, central to so much of what is happening, and I mean it in a specific sense. Israel has been offering a very specific narrative, the one that you offer in terms of your analysis based on international law, looking at Palestinian rights, making comparisons with Northern Ireland or South Africa, which says, in a very simplified way, there is an injustice, there are grievances. If you resolve them politically and give people their due, then conflict goes away. It can diminish, and eventually you can have peace. The narrative that Israel and many of its supporters in the United States are offering, and you saw this after the Paris attacks recently and after so many incidences, no, this isn't about Palestinian rights. This is a civilizational war between the democratic, rational, liberal West, of which Israel is the vanguard, and the savage, barbaric, extremist, irrational East. And that narrative has been around for a long time, but it seems to be taking root more and more broadly. How do we, first of all, do you see that? And what can we do to resist it and to defeat this notion that we are destined to permanent civilizational and religious war?
No, you formulate that issue, which is, I think, a very central issue in a very clear and useful way. I think every time a spectacular terrorist incident occurs of the sort that occurred in Paris, the Israeli leadership tries to say, that's what we're up against. You know, it tries to associate the ISIS phenomenon with the Palestinian struggle. And Netanyahu was explicit in saying that. Sharon, after the 9/11 attack, said, Yasser Arafat is our Osama bin Laden. You know, creating that kind of equation. And it really builds on the Samuel Huntington Clash of Civilizations hypothesis that was set forth in the early 1990s. And I think the only way of getting beyond that is by exposing its essentially polemical character. That if you look closely at the Palestinian struggle, you'll see that it has pursued reasonable goals in a way that is proportional to what justice and law would prescribe. And it has very little to do with political extremism. Even Hamas, when it entered the political process in 2006, at the urging, interestingly, of Washington, I think made a fundamental decision that they would pursue their goals by political means. And they basically abandoned an armed struggle scenario. That didn't mean they abandoned the option of responding to violence with whatever means they possessed. But it does mean that they didn't look to liberation or Palestinian emancipation through some kind of liberation. And they've indicated that they would settle for a 50-year coexistence arrangement provided Israel withdrew to 1967 borders. So it seems to me that effort to portray the Palestinian struggle as an example of the problem of containing political extremism is just a way of manipulating ideologically the real situation. You say, what can be done about it? I think I think it was somebody on the Supreme Court that said long ago, truth is the best disinfectant. And I think that's what meetings like this seek to do, is to get beyond the polemical and propagandistic ways of understanding violence and conflict in the world, and examine where are the constructive opportunities that will lead us in the direction of sustainable peace.
Thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you for the questions.